thank you all for coming. My name is Andre Wong. I am the Chair of the Government Affairs for the Gresham Chamber. And today we're pleased to have a discussion on one of the more critical issues facing Oregon policymakers, and that's how to deal with PERS, Oregon's Public Employees Retirement System. So today's presentation, I just want to note, is not going to be an indictment on the PERS system itself, but it's supposed to be an informational and analytical examination on PERS and its impact and options facing our state. So I just wanted to let you know that we have cards on your seat for a question and answer period. If you have a question for Mr. Tapogna, you can fill that out and we can have that during the Q&A. So today we're pleased to have John Tapogna, who's the president of ECONorthwest, an economic consulting firm with offices in Oregon and Idaho. John's areas of focus are education, workforce development, and child support enforcement policy. John holds his degrees from the University of Oregon and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Prior to joining ECONorthwest, he was a budget analyst for the Congressional Budget Office and serves on advisory groups such as the Oregon Quality Education Commission's Cost Panel and the Governor's Revenue Restructuring Task Force. He's also provided fiscal analysis for a variety of governing bodies, including the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, the Oregon and Washington state legislatures, and numerous local governments. Will you please welcome our speaker, John Tapogna.
Thank you. And I don't think I'd underestimate by saying that, or overstate by saying that PERS is one of the biggest issues that's facing this legislative session. I think we had a big vote last week in Salem, where in essence I think the session is sort of hinging on some kind of combination of PERS reform and possibly some tax increases to balance the budget, and certainly a lot of debate around the PERS reform that passed and whether it's big enough to leave us with a sustainable system, leave our public services competitive relative to our neighbors to the north in Washington. So what I wanted to do here, as was sort of foreshadowed, is really this is a technical description of the problem that I have developed, and I would say that before you can get into public policy solutions, you really have to have a clear understanding of the nature of the problem that you're dealing with. And I think one of the issues that has hampered the session to date is that it came into this session with an incomplete understanding or disagreement about the nature of the problem. Was this a problem that's sort of a short-term blip that was created by, say, for example, the 2008 stock market crash that created a funding problem for the system that in the near term could remedy itself as the stock market recovers? Or is this a bigger sort of generational problem that has to do with the structure of the system that we created? I am persuaded, after having worked through this data, that this is a bigger problem than sort of a short-term 2008 investment problem. That really this goes back to as far as 1945 and the creation of Money Match, and a program that almost in equal parts accident, in some ways intention, created an unusually expensive benefit program relative to those that are offered by other states. So that with the introduction, I'll now move through some of the slides. And when I say people came into this session with confusion about the problem, I think I don't blame them for that, because this is a very complicated system, and it's very hard, unless you spend an awful lot of time doing it, to understand how we stand relative to other states in terms of our problem. And so here's one of the key issues that I was trying to grapple with, and one of the points that if you follow this debate closely you will hear, which is Oregon is one of, while I would contend a troubled system, it is one of the better funded systems in the country, which that just seems like that doesn't connect. And I could understand why people would think that. This is a map produced by the Pew Center on the States for fiscal year 2010, and what it's doing, it's going across the United States and looking at state-sponsored systems, and they're saying for all of the liabilities that had been accrued for all the public service up to the end of 2010, what were the assets that were backing up those obligations, state by state? And the states that had better than 80% coverage, assets to their liabilities, were colored in blue, and those with less were colored in gray. And you can see that Oregon and Washington up here, Oregon at the time was 87% funded, Washington 95%. We're certainly happy that we're not Illinois at 45%, some of these other places, and we should be happy that we're not Illinois. So this is one piece of information, and you can hear public officials in their statements say, you know, we see the escalating costs with PERS, but remember, it's one of the better funded systems. And they're speaking the truth when they say that. So we're going to have to work through that as a sort of what appears to be a contradiction, but ultimately isn't. So what I have to square that against is a statement by a statement that was considered by 40 sharp economists from Harvard and Yale and MIT and University of Chicago, Stanford, Berkeley. These are people who, if you ask them lots of different questions, you'll get some disagreement. But they were posed this question, these 40 economists, back in October of last year. And they said, during the next 2 decades, some U.S. states, unless they substantially increase taxes, cut spending, and or change public sector pensions, will require a combination of severe austerity budgets, a federal bailout, and or default. That's pretty gloomy language there, suggesting a big problem. And so they were asked, do you agree or disagree with this statement? And in a group that you can frequently get them to sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, disagreement, you ended up with this, 28% strongly agreeing, 64% agreeing, a handful here uncertain or no opinion. So close to a consensus here of these national economists looking at the condition of state pensions and saying there's some real trouble. The report that they were, or the series of reports that these folks had been paying attention to that led to these opinions were completed by a pair of financial economists, one who's currently at Stanford, the other one in New York. And they had done a series of interstate comparisons of state pension systems and had ultimately ranked Oregon as being one of the most troubled systems in the country. And in fact, in the fall of 2011, by their analysis, they had said if Oregon had priced its pensions appropriately and then attempted to fully fund them over the course of 30 years, their modeling suggested that they'd either have to raise taxes so high or cut spending so deeply that everyone would leave the state. It was Oregon and Ohio were the 2 states that were in that position, which again, just confuses me. I read that and I say, well, wait a minute, but we're one of the better funded systems in the country. How can you put those 2 things together? That didn't make sense to me. So now the rest of this is going to try to reconcile those 2 points. How can we be one of the better funded systems but be in so much trouble? So how do you run into trouble with the public pension system? I'm sure there's a longer list than 2, but here's 2 ways you could do it. One would be to design a very expensive program. And the second way would be to defer or delay contributions to fund a system regardless of how generous it is. So you could design something that we all agreed was a sort of a fair, predictable program and just skip the payments. And then 30 years from now say, oh, we're behind 30 years on payments, you'd be in trouble. That's in no small part what Illinois and some of the lower funded states have done. I would argue that this is not Oregon's problem, deferring or delaying the contributions. It's that they designed, almost by accident, a very expensive program and have attempted to keep up with the payments. And that is, in no small part, why we are here today, is because the bill that the PERS board has presented to school districts and to municipalities and to counties is taking a very steep jump. And it's caught everybody's attention, and now folks are sort of coalescing and trying to think about what to do and how to act. So my next several slides, I'm going to try to support this argument that we designed an unusually expensive program. We are trying to keep up with those payments. The analogy that I give sometimes is imagine we're a middle income family and we purchase a car that is sort of beyond our means. But we have been very intentional about keeping up with car payments because we just made that a priority. We said we're going to keep this car and we're going to keep up with those payments. But by having kept up with those payments, we may have to forego contributions into our kids' 529 account. We may not have money to patch the hole in our roof and do other kinds of things that we need to do. So that's the fundamentals. So now just a little bit of PERS history to get us started and to illustrate why we are where we are. So PERS got started as a program back in 1945, and the foundational program was this formula called money match. And that is not a common program, certainly not a common program in operation today. There are a handful of places that do it. But money match was basically a program where a member put in contributions into an account over time. Those were then invested on their behalf during their tenure in government service. And then upon retirement, you took that account and you said, okay, the employer hasn't been adding to that, so the employer is going to match it dollar for dollar. And then we're going to take this sort of doubled account and we're going to turn it into an annuity that will last until the expected end of the beneficiary's life. We have to assume an interest rate that amount of money will earn while they're withdrawing those payments. That's an important piece that we'll talk about. We have assumed a high interest rate there. And then in addition to that, we're going to put a cost of living increase on top of it. So that's the basic functionality of the money match program. Yep.
I get to give the first question here. So under the money match system, the employee puts in money, which then grows at either an assumed rate or the stock market rate.
Well, we'll get into that, yeah.
But the employer did not put in money at that time for their part of the match.
Correct. And so what the employer is doing sort of behind the scenes is they have an actuary over here on the side who's anticipating what those matches will need to be. And they are reserving money in anticipation of having to match them upon retirement.
And yet your slide where you had the two problems, you indicated that Oregon had not failed to fund its system.
Yes, it goes back to the original chart that I had that had 87% funded ratio.
But so if they had put the money in at the exact same rate as they put in for the employee,
right,
then their contributions would have grown on a one-to-one basis. And we wouldn't have nearly the problem because those monies would have adjusted at the exact same rate and our money match would be exactly the same.
If we had kept up all along,
right,
that is hypothetically true.
Okay.
So, but still, the amount that you're having to put in is going to be the issue relative to other states because of the size of the benefit that ultimately is created out of this money match.
But the size of the benefit is reflective of the growth in the market. So if they had put in the 6%, which they didn't put in.
We'll get to that. So, a little more history here. In the 1950s and 1960s, after the development of money match, there were weak investment returns by the Oregon Investment Council. And it actually didn't work out very well for public employees in the 50s and 60s. And they were looking at other states that had more traditional defined benefit formulas and saying, maybe we should switch to one of those because we see public employees coming out with more predictable and reliable income upon the end of their public service. So in 1968, the legislature replaced money match with a program called pension plus annuity. So what it was is sort of a combination of a defined formula pension, which basically says how many years did you work, and I'm going to give you a percentage of replacement on your income for every year that you work, and then there was still a little bit of an annuity tied to that in a money match fashion, but they, for a period of time, eliminated money match. And then two people in 1968 came back and said they had been adversely affected by that decision, and the legislature reinstated money match on their behalf. But not on only their behalf. They simply just reinstated the program thinking that it would only be used by a handful of people. It's 1968. In 1979 then, the PERS board created yet another program. So you saw that money match, you had the pension plus annuity in 1968. Then in 1979 they said, let's get rid of this whole annuity thing and money match completely for people. We want to create a much more predictable formula. And so they created something called the full formula. And when they created the full formula, they had to come up with a rationale. What are we trying to do with this formula for a career employee? So they set a goal in 1979 that post-retirement income for a career employee who worked 30 years for the state or for a school district or a municipality, when added to Social Security, which was assumed to replace about 30% of wages for your typical retiree, that PERS should replace 75 to 85, excuse me, the combination of PERS and Social Security should replace 75 to 85% of the employee's pre-retirement income. So they built a formula where PERS was going to replace 50% for a career employee. They were assuming Social Security would replace another 30%, and that got them into this 75 to 85% range. And so they built a formula. This is for tier 1 full formula that basically said for every year that you work, you get 1.67% of your final average salary. So it literally works when if you go out under the formula, you say how many years did you work? I worked 30 years. Times 1.67% equals 50%. That was back to that goal. Times your final average salary is your pension. And then you get a COLA on top of that. So that is literally what they designed at that point in time, and that's what they were trying to accomplish, is to get people with Social Security into that 75 to 85% replacement range, with the idea that in retirement, your expenses go down some. Many people have paid off mortgages at that point. They don't have work expenses. They have less commuting, those kinds of things. And that's why they're setting that goal at less than 100%. So that's, here you are, 50% replacement at 30 years. In the background, money match is still operating, however, and some features were added and behaviors were added as well. So all of these tier 1 members, they have the option of that pension plus annuity that was created in 1968. They have the option of that formula that I just described that replaces 50% of pre-retirement income for a career employee, but they also have this money match program that's sitting in the background. And beginning in 1973, they added a feature to the money match program, the guaranteed rate of return on the member's account. And it was tied to the assumed earnings rate of the assets. It started, I think, at 5.5% in 1973. Ultimately, that has ratcheted up to 8% where it stands today. There's a debate that be settled in the next month or so to perhaps bring that down a little bit. But there it's been since about that point at 8%. That's the blue line. The green line are the actual investment returns that were earned by the Oregon Investment Council in all of those years. And then the PERS board, which is an administrative board appointed by the governor, came through with administrative decisions that had the result of boosting the value of those accounts in money match. And that people have called or deemed excess crediting. So crediting the member's accounts in excess of the guarantee. And so you can see these various points here where they weren't giving the entire piece, but they were crediting in excess of the guarantee. That happened to various degrees up until 1999, when the city of Eugene and other public employers blew the whistle and said, this isn't sustainable. You can't, in the good times, be giving better than the guarantee and not reserving much in the bad times, and that's in part where we're running into trouble. And so literally in 1999, I think the board had credited something like 20% to the accounts. And the judge came back and said, you've got to they set it back to about 12% for that year. And then basically said, you can't do that anymore. And it hasn't happened since 1999. So what you ended up with that money match, again, remember, a money match program that didn't work very well for people in the 50s and 60s, worked unusually well in this era. So I sort of characterize this as almost an accidental chemistry experiment, where you had the original rules set up in 1945, they're amended with a guaranteed rate of return in 1973, you then sprinkle in the excess crediting in the 80s and 1990s in what turned out to be one of the most unusually volatile stock markets of our time. And so what happened for somebody who started in the early 1970s is that member account was growing. It doesn't have to suffer these falls here, is growing bigger in those high points, grows very high here at the end of the 90s. And then if they continue to work into the 2000s, they get the guaranteed rate of return instead of this loss. And again, a guaranteed rate of return instead of that loss. And so it was a combination of sort of an unusual plan that I would argue most didn't understand the consequences of, hit up against an unusual investment period at the same time. So what happened, I've got a couple different charts to sort of show what the outcomes of that then were. So here is, these are years of retirement, starting in 1990, going through 2011. Here we're only looking at career employees, so people that work 30 years of service. And again, I've just drawn a red line there at that 80% ratio. And what I've done here is take the PERS outcomes of replacement ratio and added 30 percentage points for an assumption that that's what Social Security is doing. So you can see that in the early 1990s, we were in and around 90% replacement for folks, which is maybe more generous than the PERS board had intended, but certainly wouldn't drive a lot of people here to have a big policy debate. It gradually started to come up to about 100% in the mid-90s, and then really took off to 2000 was sort of the peak. 2000 is the peak because of market timing, in essence. You had people starting their careers in the late 60s and early 70s. Their accounts had grown to sizable levels as we got into the mid to late 1980s. And then as those 1990 returns really took off and they got the excess crediting, they just spiked the value of that. So you had people on average, this is an average, and you had some people higher, some people lower, people on average retiring with their PERS fund, giving them 100% replacement just by PERS alone. And then when they hit Social Security retirement age, they got up to an additional 30% replacement. So you have a class of individuals in this era who are financially better off in retirement than they were in their working years. That starts to come down over time because two things. One is just the market timing. These folks got started later in time, and so the full impact of those 1990 returns were not as advantageous to them. They were coming into that period with smaller accounts to begin with, so the compounding didn't work. And then the 2003 reforms also start to affect these folks. That we aren't doing excess crediting anymore, and there were some other reforms that slowed that down as well. And you will continue to see this over time come back down toward that adequate retirement level.
You have the proportion of those who are receiving benefits at 30 years and those who are lower than that?
Right. Well, you're anticipating my next couple of charts, because that people said, well, wait a minute, this is just the career folks. The issue, and I didn't understand this until midway through this spring or winter, this is somewhere between 12 to 15% of folks would go out with full career. But in terms of this program's disproportionate windfalls, the windfalls are bigger in proportion for shorter career people. Because in essence, what happened, if you read the Oregonian closely,
I'm sorry. We might as well read, whatever anti-PERS statement you want to have. The
Right.
last Oregonian article said that PERS is to fault for not garnishing criminals' wages.
okay, well, that wasn't the one I was referring to.
But let's be careful.
There was
quoting
one.
the Oregonian.
Ted Sickinger is a careful reporter. I don't know if he did that one,
But he didn't do that one, but
Okay.
it was on the front page, of course, so.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Must be true then.
So Ted Sickinger, they have that database now, so they can look at all kinds of things. But he did come across somebody in 2012 who worked 5 years in the late 70s to early 80s for the Corvallis School District, retired, he just left, that was early in his career, left with a final average salary of about $10,000 in the early 1980s, had that account of 5 years worth of money in it, but it stayed there and it grew with the excess crediting, et cetera. And he then went off and worked for Hewlett-Packard for the rest of his career, ultimately retired last year, and his account had grown to such a size that with Money Match, it created a $28,000 benefit for his 5 years of service that grows to perpetuity with a cost of living adjustment. So just to illustrate that, again, remember this if the full formula were the program that was sort of determining what people received, you would expect retirees to come out sort of in and around this red line. That they would be, depending on how many years of service, you would expect retirees to be sort of clustered around this red line. And so what we did was take a look at how they fared in 2000, and you can see you have this diffusion up here. And of course, for these shorter term folks, the proportionality is even larger than for the career folks. So this is the class of 2000 retirees. That is the peak of the impact of Money Match on retirement. So you've got, all these folks here at sort of the 100% replacement. But then just lots of different disproportionate outcomes relative to what they would have received under formula. If you roll forward to last year, you can see folks are still, they're starting to move down toward that line. And if we go out, I'm gonna say if you went out 7 years from today and didn't even change the law, but you went out 7 years from today, I think you start to see people clustering around that red line. Because the money match, the excess crediting didn't affect those folks as much. And the market timing wasn't very good for them. They got their career started too late to hit. So you can sort of see this is sort of how that's working. So where is this system headed? These are the employer rates that are predicted by the systems actuary. These are actually the historic ones going back to 1975. These include the member contribution in addition to what the employers have been putting into the system. Member contribution is 6%. Sometimes the member pays for that, sometimes the employer pays for that on their behalf. That's called a pickup. But I sort of put those two things together. Historically, they've been sitting sort of between the 15 and 20% of payroll range. This is sort of where we are right now with this spike, and it is this jump that has sort of caught everybody's attention and has, I would say, caused the legislative action around this. The forecast going forward, if you sort of take the midline projection of investment returns as projected by the actuary, would suggest that those rates will stay up in the high 20s until about 2029, 2030. And what's going on there is that class of 2000 retirees is starting to die in 2030, and that's why those rates start to come back down about 30 years after the peak of those returns. Of course, things could be worse or better. If stock market returns were sort of 10.5%, if we had a nice run for the next 15 to 20 years and ended up this period with an overall average of 10.5% returns, those rates will come down. On the other hand, if we don't, if we have something worse than that midline projection, rates could go considerably higher. And I think it's sort of rates like these that were the ones that the national economists were looking at, saying, you know, if you end up here, you're going to end up affecting migration in and out of the state of Oregon if the rates go that high. So that's the actuary's projections. And now I come to a chart that, for me, sort of told the story of how could we have one of the better funded systems in the country, but also have one of the most troubled systems at the same time. And it comes down to this. This is, for Oregon, this is the measurement of our accrued liability as of the end of fiscal year 2010. It was about $60 billion. That's what we owe people for all the public services that have been delivered as of that point, future benefits. Our assets as of that date were about 87% of that amount. So in that very first chart I showed you, they were paying attention to the ratio between the green bar and the red bar. And that's a very common way to benchmark states across one another. But what they weren't paying attention to that one is, where do these two relate to the total size of the state's economy? And so this blue bar is a measurement of our total personal income in the state of Oregon, not total personal income taxes, literally total personal income, all the wages, dividends, et cetera, interest earned by Oregonians. That was about $140 billion in 2010. Why those national economists saw Oregon having the trouble that it was in is because you come over here to a state like Washington, and what you see is their total liability is only a couple $2 billion higher than our total liability, but their economy is twice as large. And so consequently, the economic engine that is in place to help finance that liability and help prop up those assets is much larger. So the rates that they have to charge their school districts, their municipalities, their counties, their water districts, et cetera, are quite a bit lower. So it is true to say that we're both doing, relative to other states, and certainly relative to Colorado, we're doing a better job of keeping up with our payments. But the engine that we have to pay, that we have in place to help pay for that is quite a bit smaller, and consequently, our rates have to be quite a bit higher. So now I'm going to talk, that's the problem statement. Is that questions about that analysis? So I'm going to transition now to a discussion of if, well, the legislature is still sitting down and grappling. They believe, some believe that they've found the solution with 822, others believe they need to go further. Regardless of who you believe, advancing some principles around how would you judge one package against the other. You might look at 4 different categories of criteria. Number 1 would be adequacy. You want to go back and make sure you're not violating a principle of an adequate retirement. You could use that 75 to 85%, or if some other number is better, use that and argue for it. I think in addition to adequacy, there is sort of a notion of fairness around expectations as well. If you make an abrupt change to the system and somebody was literally walking into the PERS office building and about to, they had studied their retirement, and you need to think about that and think about how abrupt a change should be for somebody who's literally on the cusp of retirement. Legality, obviously, is an important one. And there, interestingly, national observers would say Oregon has an advantage over other states in that we went through a pretty deep change in our pension system. First in 2003, we've done it in 1996. The Supreme Court and justices have spilled a lot of thinking. They've written down a lot of their thoughts about what the system is and what the promises were and all that kind of stuff. So we have more legal history to be able to guide our decisions than many other states do that haven't gone through pension reform. So we have to pay attention to legality. Sustainability, the question will be, for example, with 822, if 822 is the package for this year, what is the likelihood that you would have to come back either this next year or the year after that to do something else to try to bring the system into place? I think you get varying commentary, even from Richard Devlin, Senator Devlin, who sponsored 822, as to whether that package will be the last word on PERS for 5 years. I think he anticipates he would have to come back next year or two. And then fiscal impact, which is really the issue that folks have rallied around, which is how do we bring some rates down so we can better fund our schools, better fund our municipal services, our police services, et cetera.
Can you quantify long-term viability?
Long-term viability.
5 years, 10 years?
Long-term viability. I guess one standard would be to what extent does a change today, is it a change that with some tax increase and some spending cuts prevents or alleviates the need to go back and try to do reform again within the next 5 years or 10 years?
With all due respect, I think I would like to suggest a change to your thinking in the fiscal impact aspect on this chart, because one of the aspects that I have not seen anyone considering other than the PERS board itself is the impact not on the fiscal health of the PERS system, but the overall fiscal health of the government agencies. Let me explain. There are 70,000 people who are currently Tier 1 members who could retire right now. And while changing PERS may reduce the unfunded liability by hitting benefits, it also has the impact of encouraging those people to continue to work. And I'm one of those
Right.
people whose
Yep.
paperwork is ready to file.
Right.
And I can't because of 822. Because the impact of 822 over the course of my retirement will cost me $150,000. And so I have to keep working, which costs my school district twice as much money because I'm twice as expensive as a beginning teacher. And if you multiply that by
Right.
70,000 employees, you've got a huge immediate fiscal impact, not on PERS, but on the agencies that have to pay these employees instead of pushing them out the door.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly in favor of all comprehensive analysis of impact. I mean, in addition to that, is the sort of the service level. When you're replacing experienced staff with less experienced staff, et cetera, there certainly have been arguments in and around public safety in particular. You don't want to have, well, you just need to be careful about what you're incenting and the overall impact on public service. That's well taken. The policy options that have been debated to date have fallen into 5 broad categories. They were advanced sort of at separate times by the City Club of Portland, issued a report a couple of years ago that advanced this sort of slate. The outgoing PERS board chair, James Dalton, he was one of the first PERS board members in the post-2003 era. In fact, he was one of the inaugural members of that. He went out last November and basically articulated these 5 approaches. Limiting cost of living adjustments, which 822 did, the governor has proposed, et cetera. The point there is 60% of the system's liability is in retirement status. So 60% of the, remember I said that the total accrued liability of the system was $60 billion. 60% of that liability is associated with people who are retired now. And so the only way that you could go back and address some of those blue dots from 2000, or even the blue dots from 2010, 12, that are way above that red line, is by limiting COLAs going forward and saying, the argument there would be big windfalls were won through money match, and so we're going to mitigate those to some degree with a change in the cost of living adjustment going forward. The second one would be to change the annuity rate that is used in money match calculations, and we're getting into the weeds, the policy weeds here. But as I described money match, you've got the member account, you've got the employer match, you then have a pile of money, and you say, I'm going to turn this into an annuity that will last until the expected end of the expected life of the beneficiary. And the key critical question is, what is the interest rate that is assumed as that money is being withdrawn over time? What is the rest of that money is that earning? If you were to take a doubled money match account and turn it over to a market-based annuity, they would offer you somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% right now. Because in essence what they're saying is, we're picking a number of benefits, and we are going to commit to give you those with certainty. So they would choose a risk-free rate of return because they want to know that they will have the funds to give that to you over 30 years. If were it a sort of a, well, we'll give you this if the market does well, and we'll give you that if the market does poorly, you might be able to support an 8% rate of return on annuity, but what we're saying is we're giving you certainty, this stream of payments. So the market would say, we can give you a 3, maybe a 3.5% rate of return right now. So that was in City Club and other reports. Reforming methods to calculate final average salary, that is, relates more to the formula. It doesn't relate to money match at all. and really hasn't been much of an issue lately because money match has been the main means by which people have left the system. But as the formula becomes more and more important going forward, some argue that you need to tighten up that definition of final average salary. So, we're very careful about what overtime is used and sick time is used and those kinds of things, late career raises and things of that nature. The fourth is, this really gets into the weeds, but it is the use of the members' contributions. In 2003, remember that 6% that was going into, to create the money match account. One of the 2003 reforms was to pull that money out of those, the going forward contributions, pull them out of the member account and put them into something more like a 401k on the side. The idea at the time was, we just want to slow down money match as much as we can, so we're just going to stop putting the member accounts in so we can slow down money match, and it's had that effect. So they put it over into into like a 401k vehicle that just went up and down with the market. The proposals have been to take some or all of that and put it back into the system to help pay for the system, because in essence, what's going on is you always have this defined benefit formula over here for tier 1 and tier 2 that was designed to be as generous as it was supposed to be. And people have been receiving for 10 years this extra money in addition to that defined benefit, et cetera. Yep.
On that one, is the proposal that you've heard to take the IAP money, put it back into PERS, and have it count for money match formulas? Or
There have been, so the Oregon School Boards Association bill created yet another account that wouldn't count toward money match.
Okay.
I think the argument is that that would probably fall lower on the scale of legal challenge. And so sort of a comprehensive package would say, only do this, put it back into the regular account, but marry it with that, which then lowers the money match value. This would stand, if you simply put it back into the regular account, all you're doing is going back to what existed before, so its chances of standing legal challenge would be quite high. And then this last one, eliminating this obscure tax remedy for people that don't live in the state of Oregon, passed in 822. I'm not going to go into great detail on that one. Everyone likes it because it doesn't affect people who live here.
Yeah, no voters. When you first introduced this slide, you said these are the 5 areas that have been discussed. But there is a 6th area that has been discussed, but in my opinion hasn't gotten enough publicity by Ted Zickinger.
Okay.
And that is extending the repayment period of the unfunded liability so that the repayment period better matches the actual use of that liability. Right now, the unfunded liability is a 20-year period. And yet, 20 years from now, more than half of the people will be retired and continuing to draw on that money. So in other words, if we extended it to a 40-year period, we would cut down by hundreds of millions of dollars the amount of money that the agencies need to pay, and that money would continue to come in between year 21 and year 40 when those people are actually using that money. How come that's not, because that was actually discussed in the legislature when I was there. How come that's not on your list of options?
That is a policy option, as is the rate collar, which is another way of it sort of has the same effect. A rate collar has the same effect as your extension of the amortization.
Agreeing and disagreeing here.
So the amortization it would be like extending your mortgage, and so your total payment over time would go up because you'd be paying interest.
You're not paying interest because you're not borrowing from anybody. What you're doing is paying back the money that the retirees are using.
Right.
You're not bonding this debt. All you're doing is paying it back
Right, but your total payments, and the actuary scored this, your total payments on a 20-year amortization. So our current liability last scored was 16 billion at the end of 2011. If you amortize it and pay it over 20 years, your total payments would be about 35 billion. And if you did it over 30 years, it'd be in the neighborhood of 50 billion.
Who are you paying interest to? That's not the way I read the chart that the PERS board had.
So there's a, if you go to the PERS website, and on the front page, there's a little piece off to the side that says cost containment measures. There's a memo that deals with this specifically, by Milliman, and a 2 or 3 page memo that talks about the amortization and the impacts on rates and the total cost of funding the system.
So does that disagree then with the cost savings overview provided in the report by the PERS board, where they suggested that concept to the legislators?
The PERS board,
It's a 45, 50-page PDF document where they say it cuts, for instance, increasing it to a 30-year period is a $534 million savings.
In the
for
current
each-
biennium.
For each biennium.
right,
Because it reduces
right.
the payment due by spreading it out over 30 years.
Right, but then your total net present value of all the payments you're making are higher. You're just spreading out those payments over a longer period.
Total net might be higher with this because you're not getting market return, you're not getting the 8% assumed liability that you assume for
Right.
return on
And-
the payments now.
So, lowers rates in the long run, but would keep rates somewhat higher in the
Over a
future.
longer period of time, because you don't get the 8% this year, next year, and so forth.
A couple of things. The question is, on those proposals, who is ultimately going to be able to make some decisions? And if it is referred to from the taxpayer or from the public standpoint for vote or whatever else, which you can't rely on, understanding of some measure that's on the ballot. But either way, you end up with still, and if the decision-making is in the legislature, we haven't seen anything that has come out either from the vote standpoint or capability from the legislature standpoint that weathers through the fox and the hen house situation. The judicial situation is there. Every possible entity in the state is part of it, and those that are involved in any vote, the ones that are 90% to turn out to the vote are the ones that are in the system. So they will support that, continuance one way or another. And you can read the editorials and so on that are out there that, by golly, I've worked this, for 30 years and I've got it due, and don't dare try to take it away from me. So it's, from my standpoint, as an outside person, I'm saying, do not vote, do not approve anything that is a tax increase for any entity, library, fire, anything, because it is all a result of the impact of the unfunded liability.
So there were sort of two related thoughts in that point. One is, are the people who are empowered to make a change being affected sort of by their own personal circumstances versus a separate one, very legitimate and substantial lobbying on behalf of the beneficiaries, that's the job of those lobbyists.
Mm-hmm.
I remain an optimist that we have statespeople, and in the legislature, and that anything that you see that is not proceeding the way that you want is not because they're pulling out their own personal pieces and looking at. If things are not proceeding as you would like, I would say, you know, there is this big battle going on, which is, it would go on in any state. This is a big issue. And, you know, that is, in some respects, the job of some in Salem to look at those and protect those. Greg Hartman, et cetera. That is his job as an advocate, to make the best argument that he can. And
But in that same vein, 2003, it was put to the voters and said, okay, you know, we think that, you know, first people have to put in 6%.
Well, in
you know, to contribute.
2003.
And then every one of the entities said, I really hate to have you suffer like that. We're gonna put it in for you. So it was a 6% increase.
Well, no, in 2003, that was all legislative.
Well,
action.
whenever that vote was, I don't know if it's 2002, 3, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the result of what happened.
Before you go on, I just want to make sure that we're at 6 o'clock, so we want to
Okay.
make sure to let John finish his presentation, and then we can have, you have offline discussions with him afterwards, so.
Right.
So go ahead.
Okay, so I will finish with this slide, which I will say is, this is a slide as a technician. Yeah, my wife is a PERS beneficiary. I've got 2 sisters who are PERS beneficiaries. My brother-in-law retired in 2000 with the outcomes that you saw on the table. And so I don't
You're
come at
buying
this
dinner.
from the perspective.
And
But this is the one, as a technician, as an Oregonian, as someone who's concerned about and interested in the state's future going forward, that is the most troubling chart that I have produced yet, which is the forecast of the employer rates under, here's current law, and this is for school districts, and PERS with Senate Bill 822 enacted, relative to Washington's teacher retirement system. And that's only teachers, but they have classified employees, administrators that are in another system that is running at relatively similar employer rates. This is a gulf of a difference here. And were I, that's about 15 percentage points of payroll that school districts on the Oregon side would be paying for the legacy costs of a program that, whether it was an accident or it was some intention with the excess crediting, et cetera, a generational accident in public policy, I would argue. Were I the mayor of Vancouver, or Washougal, or Camas, I would turn that into a banner, and I would fly it from the front of my city hall, and I would make copies of this, and I'd hand it out to all the real estate agents in the area. And I would say, if anybody that you have that's looking for housing on this side of the border is considering anything in the other side, hand them this and tell them that you've got about 15% of your school district payroll is going to be paying for sort of an era of 30-year excess that Washington didn't implement and doesn't have to fund. That's troubling. That's troubling for Oregon if we go forward with this entire gap, and I think will be it will be difficult. Difficult when we get into conversations like the one that sort of the competing over the Nike headquarters or anything else. It sets Washington up very well relative to us if we run forward with the full cost of this system. So, I have answered some questions, but I'm happy to answer others. I'm happy to.
I'll give you one more at this
Yeah.
point. Based on this chart, I've been a teacher for 31 years.
Yeah.
And we have had in the past a flood of teachers from Washington to Oregon
Mhm.
because of their crappy retirement system. And so the other side of the coin that you discuss, relative to taxation, is the issue of the total benefit package being attractive to quality employees.
Right.
And Washington's retirement system for their teachers is a joke.
Well, it's
The
now
pay-
very,
the
it's
pay-
comparable to Officer.
What's
To the-
Officer?
That's the current tier that's in place for somebody that would be hired today.
Right, which, if you talk to our young teachers, they're extremely frustrated. PERS may not be able to continue in its current form. Okay, I'm not saying it can at this point, I'm not saying that it can't at this point.
Right.
But if you took that chart and showed it to teachers in the Vancouver schools and said, come to Oregon, we have a decent benefit package, it would have a different, you'd have a different audience than if you take it to a group of business people and say, this is the result.
Well, no, but they're not, anybody new coming into the system today would not be eligible for this. This is paying for the cost of people of the past.
I hear what you're saying.
The question of calling Washington's system a joke, you have to say, okay, are they in the 75 to 85% area?
They're 95%.
No, he's asking the
No, of the-
payout plus social
of the
security.
payout.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, their formula creates, it's a standard formula and it creates, I think, 60% replacement for their,
Not a joke.
Well,
Not a joke,
Social
historic.
Security plus retirement, 60%.
they
No,
get 60% out of
no.
their teacher retirement system.
Yeah, 60% teacher retirement.
Okay, plus the 30 social security.
Right.
So not a
That's-
joke.
It's not what I understand.
Other questions?
I want to go back to the one chart that you showed us where the it's way at the beginning. It doesn't appear that we can tax our way out of any of this because the income is half of what Washington has. That chart right there, liabilities and assets versus the economic wheels, as you said. Do you, as an economist, see any way to tax your way out of this with the economic wheels so low compared to Washington?
There's a technical question and then a political one that goes with it.
Well, I already know the political answer.
Right. The technical one is Oregon is a low-tax state. Washington's a low-tax state. If you look at our taxation relative to our total personal income, we used to be sort of middle of the pack because we have a very high income tax. We used to have a very high property tax, and we never had much in the way of sales taxes. In the mid-90s, we went from a property tax that was high to one that's sort of in the middle of the pack, and we still don't have a sales tax. So we slipped down the tables, and just by sort of broad average measures, we're in the sort of bottom 10 in terms of taxation per total personal income, as is Washington.
As is Washington.
Washington is relatively, because they sort of are in the same issue. They have no income tax, they have a very high sales tax and property taxes. So there is space for taxation relative to the sort of overall US average to move up. And the question will be the question that Beaverton is facing right now with respect to this issue, because it is a very high profile issue. They're going out to their voters right now for a local option levy on their schools. And just the way that the math is working at this point in time, about half of that option levy will go to fund the increase in the PERS under Senate Bill 822's reforms. The other half would produce additional service or help them revise some of the services they used to have in the past. So that's when I say,
Is the local option on all residents or on business only?
It's all residents.
It's a
All
property
residents.
tax.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
business and personal property
Okay,
tax.
thank you, sorry.
Yep. So that's, I mean, that is the dynamic. You've got a lot of this debate out there about this system and its costs and the promises that were made and what need to be kept and what could be reformed, et cetera. It takes people smarter than me. It would be more of a Dan Levy and a Kevin Looper, who are political strategists, to say, in this environment, could you talk Oregonians into coming up toward the US average in terms of its total taxation as a share of total? How would you tell that, how would you talk them into that? And how much does the resolution of this public policy issue either, how much would the PERS issue hinder that conversation?
Well, it's easy to, from the Dan Levy standpoint, to target then the businesses as the cash cow, the taxable, because that, from a political standpoint,
Mhm.
has legs.
Right.
But that also would be the reason that some of those businesses would then move
Right.
to Washington. And there's the economic rub,
So-
as shown here.
So the issue with taxation in Oregon is we are, the system may not be as progressive as the Oregon Center on Public Policy would like, but in relative terms, because we're a progressive income taxation state, and no sales tax, which tends to be regressive, we are a relatively progressive taxation state, certainly relative to Washington, which is one of the most regressive in the country. The political struggle for Oregon is as you attempt to get more revenue, you can continue to try to be even more progressive than you are now, but you're really stretching, you're going places that other states have. You're pushing that outer limit. And, you know, some would argue you're pushing it so much that people are popping into Clark County and other places to get away from it. If you want to get up to the US average, you're probably talking about a broader tax reform that would have some kind of consumption tax associated with it, and that would have a much broader participation. Tim Nesbitt wrote about that in Oregonian on Tuesday.
It seems though that if we were to go that direction, to be more like the US average, then it would make Washington look even more tempting, because they're a low tax state and,
Right.
you know, it's a.
So then the question is, what do you do with the money? I mean, if you went up the tax scale and you really bought things that people valued, and in some way we, you started to see Oregon State, University of Oregon, with reasonable tuition relative to U of W, and you had the schools here were starting to outshine the schools in Washington, and the roads didn't have ruts in them. Then that's sort of the trade-off. If you're buying things that families and businesses value with those additional tax dollars.
I guarantee you, they wouldn't be going to those things.
Well, and so that's a judgment you have to make as a voter and a taxpayer.
Do any of your charts or anything that you've done measure what the potential would be of the surge? And I remember that in 2000,
Yep.
you saw that spike because there was it's out, we're gonna change things, so that
Yep.
there was a huge move for everybody to get out so they could get what they needed or
Right.
what they thought they deserved, or, to save money, or,
Yes.
whatever the rationale or motive it was. So is there, in any of what you projected, kind of okay, well, things are gonna change, so what will happen with the people that are now there to move
Right.
out quickly to grab what they can into the old plan and
Yeah.
not be hurt like you're
Yeah.
talking about?
So depending on how you implement it, if you implement it, for example, the annuity change is the one that would really catch people's attention, because what you're talking about for the highest of the money match recipients, a switch from an 8% annuity interest rate to a market rate would reduce their benefit by 43%.
Right.
So that's a, you know, that'll get your attention. Milliman, the only number that I have in this chart that even speaks to that, this comes out of the Oregonian, but it was an analysis of Senate Bill 754. They said that if you could sort of click your, this isn't gonna be a satisfying number for you, but if you could click the wand and change the annuity rate overnight, and people just had to live with it, you'd get about $6 billion in total savings out of this bill. But they estimated that because of accelerated retirements, that savings would go down to $5.3 billion. So they see they would anticipate a pretty significant change.
Well, but the change in the annuity rate would actually result in an increase in the cost for the agencies, as opposed to a decrease in the cost for the agencies.
In what way?
Well, the return amounts that they have predicted would no longer be there. And so they have to figure out that even though you're decreasing the amount that I am getting,
Right.
you're actually increasing the amount that they have to pay because they have to make up for the decreased return that the market is supposed to be giving. So if the market's supposed to give 8, you now assume 7, you've just increased the amount that they have to pay by that 1%.
So the policy that's being dealt with here is a different one. It's basically saying that you have a rate of return that's assumed for the system as a whole, the assumed earnings rate, that has historically been used to create those annuities. And saying, we're not talking about the assumed earnings rate for the system as a whole. What we're talking about is creating a separate interest rate directing
Just for
the
the
PERS
annuity
for the creation of annuities.
Okay, got it.
But you are absolutely right on the other one, because this is actually something that's happening in the background. While all this is going on, the PERS board is likely to reduce the assumed earnings rate from probably 8 to, I'm guessing, 7.5% or something between those two.
Wow. But that actually costs.
And
the
that costs
taxpayer
money,
more.
because it automatically devalues your assets, and then you have to
Yeah,
make a call on the employer.
which is why they haven't done it yet, because you're talking
Right.
tens of hundreds.
Which
of
is,
millions more.
which is where your amortization policy will probably be used, because
They'll
when those
combine the
rates.
two, and then it'll be a negative net, got it, it'll be a net.
They'll marry those two.
They'll marry the two together.
Yeah.
Which won't save us anything.
No.
Which is what I wanna do, is save us instead of, okay.
Are these charts and diagrams available through the chamber?
Yes, you're free to
As long
share
as you're
this.
okay that we do that,
Absolutely.
I can take your email and send it to you.
Well, thank you for the thoughtful questions, and this is it's a politically charged, obviously politically, personally charged. Again, I have lots of people in my family that are old, tier 1, tier 2, et cetera, so I'm used to this.
So I guess that's a question. How long before the changes that took place, the last, before in the 2003, that line goes down? How many years, is it just until the last tier 1 and tier 2 employee dies? I mean, is that what?
Well, that's
really-
kind of what you're seeing here, is the middle of this, the middle of the distribution of the big money match outcomes they start to die in 2030.
So
I think
that's-
you start to see, you'll see it go back, if you extend this out, you're probably out in 2038, 2039.
So let's say 2039, what is the rate that the entities are gonna have to pay? Right now, they're paying, what, 25?
I think you'd be back in the neighborhood of, between 10 and 15%.
So, but right now, Washington's paying 5%.
No, Washington, no,
It's more
they're,
like 10.
Is it 10?
yeah, they're gonna get up to 14.
Oh, okay, so they're okay, all right.
Yeah, because this
So right
is
now, they're
the effect of
oh,
the
they're-
2008
all right.
losses.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they have the same, kind of the same dynamic going on here, where they had a blip in generosity that they reformed a while ago, and those folks start to come out a little earlier than ours. They have 3 tiers as well.
And then the result, the accidental, whatever decisions that took place years ago that have created this, also created the accidental liability for those who are retiring at the same time as those that are in that system, because now we're continuing to pay for those who are in that system. So it's a accidental consequence, horribly negative on people that have done 401ks, IRAs, or whatever, and say, a portion of what we're, taxed on now has to go to fund that, really accidental benefit that's created excess now.
Well, and, in the fury and frustration that some might have, remember, no beneficiary designed this system. No beneficiary is in this design.
I recognize that.
And none of the members of the, sitting members of the legislature designed it. They just have the unfortunate timing of being in office when it appeared sort of clear in terms of the size of the problem. And, I have an awful lot of.
Now they have to grow the beard that qualifies them to be the, the decision maker that is really tough.
So I guess very first question, the money match. Like for my employees, I give them a match 3%. They put in 3%, I match 3%.
Right.
So
So you're paying 6 total as a.
6 total is what they're getting, yeah. So what is the difference between that and how this system was designed back in 1945? How was, we talked about the money match
Right.
being valid at the time that I'm matching my employees' pay
As you go.
As you go.
as I go.
And that's a big difference.
And you're a defined contribution. Once you've made that contribution,
Yeah, I'm done, yeah.
the risk's on them and you're out. This one, frankly, the actuary in charge of advising the PERS board never incorporated the excess cost of money match until somewhere in the mid to late 90s. They didn't understand it. And so they were saying the cost of this system is probably in the neighborhood of 8% for an employer.
So that's what they assumed.
That's what they were estimating, because they didn't understand what was going on. And, if you come back and look at this chart, we're going through these periods where you really weren't having big dips here. So, so nobody really saw a big issue until you got into kind of this period here, and those accounts really, you had some accounts that had already gotten big, and then you get this kind of return that's a almost 20% increase to all those sizable accounts that have gotten started in the early 1970s. That's a big deal. And then for any of them that sort of moved through into this period, the system as a whole loses all this money, but then has to ask the employers to turn all those accounts into 8% returns.
Well, back in the 70s, when they made the decision that they were gonna pay the employees 6%, right, the PERS pickup, they made the decision that the employer 6%, the money match, didn't have to be paid because they are taxing districts. And these taxing districts can tax in order to make this up. So they made a conscious decision to not charge the employer 6% at that time, and then as the market returned 12, 14, 16, 18%, the employer now has to not only do the money match for the 6, they have to do the money match
For the
for
bigger
the
one.
18, 24.
The 23%.
Yeah, because they didn't pay it as they were going, you're paying it as you go, and they did, because they're taxing districts. So that talk about mistake, that was a big one.
Yeah, one of the real questions is, did any of those that were developing a system and making the decisions, did they get interviewed by the ones who gave them that job? Or
Well,
or
so
did
the
they-
issue, that, if you're looking for a guilty party out of this whole movie, the system designed to begin with, I think was probably an honest accident. The money match was just, that was an accident. If you're looking for a guilty party, it's the people that served on the PERS board during that era and were putting in crediting in excess of the guarantee. I mean,
And during that time, the PERS board was part of it, they didn't have to.
yes, it was,
open-
it had
open-
a majority
Yeah.
of people who were beneficiaries
Yeah.
themselves.
Well, and they were appointed by the governor, though, so the
That's true.
governors.
And so the governors-
And
Yeah,
Schwab
yeah.
and all of them.
Yeah, all part of the system.
Well, they all kind of didn't really get on top of it,
Yeah.
and they should have,
Yeah.
and.
They were absent the day they taught math.
You know, I'm not a genius, but I could see a problem when they were doing that.
Yeah.
In the nineties, if they were giving them, 12%, I was like, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right, not when you're.
Not when you're gonna drop at some point, you can't do that.
Well, I just want to officially bring the program to a close, but we can continue the discussion after hours, of course. But John, thank you so much for the information.